The woman named Diane Prescott, HOA president, would later call me a nobody. She would say I was nothing, that in this neighborhood, no one cared what I did for a living. She was right about one thing. Back then, I was not anybody yet. That Sunday morning, I stepped outside and saw a space. My car was gone. Just a notice taped to the mailbox post, bold letters. Vehicle towed per HOA regulation, section 4.2.1. I had moved in 3 weeks ago, had not learned all my neighbors' names, had not finished hanging the curtains, and now I was standing in the middle of a quiet street, staring at an oil stain where my car used to be. But 60 days later, I would be sworn in as the state attorney general, and everything she did to me, every receipt, every email, every vote cast in that HOA boardroom would become public record. This is the story of how I lost. Completely. Lost until there was nothing left to lose. Until their victory became their sentence. The tow yard smelled like diesel and rust. I stood at the counter, sliding my driver's license across to a man whose name tag read Kyle, waiting while he typed something into a computer that looked older than my law degree. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, one of them flickering in that irregular rhythm that makes you feel like you're developing a migraine. Everything about this place was designed to make you pay and leave quickly. $450 for the tow, $85 per day for storage. My car had been sitting here since sometime after midnight, which meant I owed $535 to get it back. I handed over my credit card without saying a word. Kyle ran it, printed a receipt, and slid it across the counter along with a yellow carbon copy of the tow authorization. I looked at the company name at the top, Mitchell & Sons Towing, family owned since 1987. There was a small logo of a tow truck with a family silhouette inside. Wholesome. I folded the receipt and put it in my purse. The drive back to Willow Creek Estates took 12 minutes. I had counted during the Uber ride to the tow yard, 12 minutes, $14, and a driver who wanted to talk about the weather. I had moved to this neighborhood specifically because it was close to the state capitol building, where I would be working in 60 days. Assuming everything went according to plan, assuming the Senate confirmation hearing didn't turn into a political circus, assuming I could keep my head down and avoid any unnecessary complications for the next 2 months. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a woman standing on the sidewalk, watching me. She was in her mid-50s, with blonde hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing a tailored blazer despite the Sunday morning quietness of the neighborhood. She had a clipboard in her hand. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, and she was already walking toward me with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had been waiting. "Ms. Rivera," she said. It wasn't really a question. "I'm Diane Prescott, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to personally welcome you to the community." She extended her hand, and I shook it. Her grip was firm, practiced. "I also wanted to make sure you received the violation notice and understood our community standards going forward." I had not, in fact, received any violation notice before my car was towed. I told her this. I explained that I had only moved in 3 weeks ago, that I was still receiving mail at my old apartment, that I had updated my address with the post office. But apparently, some things had slipped through the cracks. She listened with the kind of patient expression that teachers use when a student offers an excuse for missing homework. "The notice was sent to the address on file with the county assessor's office," she said. "We pulled the records on the 12th. Your name wasn't in the system yet." She flipped through papers on her clipboard, found what she was looking for, and showed me a copy of a letter dated 3 weeks ago. It was addressed to my old apartment. "Our responsibility is to notify the address of record. If there's a delay in county processing, that's unfortunately not something the HOA can control." I looked at the letter. It outlined the overnight parking restrictions, cited the specific bylaw, and gave a 14-day window to comply before enforcement action would be taken. The 14 days had expired 2 days before I even closed on the house. I pointed this out. Diane nodded sympathetically. "I understand this is frustrating," she said, "but the rules apply equally to everyone. That's what makes this community special. We maintain standards." She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "If you have concerns about the notification process, you're welcome to submit a formal inquiry to the Architectural Control Committee. The form is on our website. Response time is typically 4 to 6 weeks." The bylaw existed. The notice had been sent. The fact that it was sent to an address where I no longer lived, before I even owned the property, was apparently my problem to solve. I recognized the architecture of this system, every rule technically correct, every procedure followed to the letter, every exit sealed before you knew you were trapped. So, I thanked her for the welcome, told her I would review the community guidelines, and watched her walk back down the sidewalk with her clipboard tucked under her arm. I made no argument, but I made note of everything. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and the HOA documents I had received at closing. The CC&Rs were 62 pages long. I read them all. Overnight parking restrictions, Section 4.2.1, trash receptacle visibility requirements, Section 6.3, exterior paint color approval process, Section 8.1 through 8.7, landscaping height limitations, lawn maintenance schedules, and holiday decoration guidelines. Every aspect of homeownership, regulated and codified, and enforceable through a system of fines that escalate with each violation. I found the page that listed the HOA leadership: Diane Prescott, President, elected 2017, re-elected 20 and 23, Gerald Prescott, Treasurer and Reserve Fund Manager. I noticed the shared last name but didn't think much of it at the time. Linda Hoffman, Secretary and Architectural Control Committee Chair, 3 people, running a community of 200 homes. At the bottom of the financial disclosure page, there was a note about the HOA's legal counsel Prescott and Associates, retained since 2019. Another Prescott? I made a mental note, then closed the binder. I pulled the tow receipt from my purse and looked at it again. Mitchell & Sons Towing, $535. At the bottom, there was a line for payment processing. Funds remitted to HOA Reserve Fund, Account Manager Gerald Prescott. I stared at that line for a long moment. Then I walked to my car, opened the glove compartment, and placed the receipt inside. It felt like the kind of document that should be kept somewhere specific, somewhere I wouldn't forget. 60 days. I just needed to get through 60 days. 2 weeks passed without incident. I learned to park my car in the garage every night, even though it meant shuffling boxes around at 11 o'clock after long days at the transition office. I learned which neighbor walked her dog at 6 in the morning and which one checked his mailbox exactly 3 times a day. I learned that the community had a rhythm, and that rhythm was governed by rules I was still memorizing. I kept my head down, reviewed briefing documents for my confirmation hearing, and told myself that this was temporary, just a few more weeks of quiet, and then my real life would begin. On the 15th day, I came home late from a meeting that had run 3 hours over schedule, and I forgot to bring in the trash bin. The fine arrived 4 days later, $200 for violation of Section 6.3. Trash receptacles must be removed from curbside visibility no later than 6 o'clock p.m. on collection day. The notice included a timestamp from a photograph 6:47 p.m. and a citation of my previous violation as evidence of a pattern of non-compliance. I stared at that phrase for a long time. 1 towed car and 1 late trash bin, and I already had a pattern. The letter was signed by Linda Hoffman, Secretary and Architectural Control Committee Chair, with a CC line at the bottom that read Prescott and Associates Legal Counsel. I hadn't even met Linda Hoffman yet, but apparently she had already formed an opinion about my character. I sent an email to the HOA administrative address requesting a first-time courtesy waiver. I had seen the policy buried in Section 12 of the CC&Rs. New residents were eligible for a single waiver on minor violations during their first 90 days of residency, provided they had no prior enforcement history. I crafted the email carefully, citing the specific bylaw, explaining the circumstances of my late return, and noting that I had immediately corrected the issue upon arriving home. I was polite, I was professional, I was, if I'm being honest, probably too deferential for someone in my position. But I was also 53 days away from a Senate confirmation hearing, and the last thing I needed was a public dispute with my homeowners association showing up in opposition research. The response came 2 days later from Diane Prescott directly. "Dear Ms. Rivera," it began. "Thank you for your inquiry regarding the first-time courtesy waiver program. Unfortunately, your account reflects a prior enforcement action dated within the past 30 days, vehicle towing, Section 4.2.1, which disqualifies you from waiver eligibility under Section 12.4.2. The policy is designed to reward residents who demonstrate consistent compliance from the outset of their residency. We encourage you to review the community guidelines thoroughly to avoid future violations. Payment is due within 14 days to avoid additional late fees. The email was CC'd to Gerald Prescott, Linda Hoffman, and an address I didn't recognize, legal@prescottassociates.com. 4 people, monitoring a $200 trash bin fine. I called the HOA office the next morning. A woman answered, identified herself as a part-time administrative assistant, and transferred me to Diane's personal line after I explained the situation. Diane picked up on the second ring, as if she had been expecting the call. "Ms. Rivera," she said, her voice carrying that same practiced patience I remembered from our first meeting. "I understand you're frustrated, but this is a fair process. The waiver policy exists to encourage compliance, not to provide unlimited second chances. Everyone in this community follows the same rules." I asked if there was an appeal process. She told me I could submit a formal appeal to the Architectural Control Committee, that the form was available on the website, and that the committee met on the 3rd Thursday of each month. The next meeting was in 9 days. I thanked her and hung up. The appeal form was 4 pages long. It required a written statement of no more than 500 words, supporting documentation, a $25 processing fee, and signatures from 2 character witnesses within the community who could attest to my general compliance with neighborhood standards. I had lived here for 5 weeks. I didn't know anyone well enough to ask them to sign a legal document on my behalf. I filled out the form anyway, attached a copy of my work calendar showing the meeting that had run late, and submitted it with the processing fee. I did not include character witnesses. I noted in the comments section that I was a new resident and had not yet had the opportunity to establish relationships with neighbors who could serve in that capacity. 9 days later, I received the committee's decision by certified mail. Appeal denied. Reason incomplete application, missing character witness attestations. Additionally, the committee finds no evidence of special circumstances that would warrant deviation from standard enforcement procedures. This decision is final per bylaws section 14.6. The letter was signed by all 3 committee members, Linda Hoffman, Gerald Prescott, and a name I hadn't seen before, Thomas Brewer. But Gerald's signature caught my attention. Next to his name, he had listed 2 titles, treasurer and ACC member. Diane's husband sat on the committee that reviewed appeals of fines that flowed into the fund he managed. I read that signature line 3 times, making sure I understood what I was seeing. I paid the $200 that afternoon. I did not call to argue. I did not send an angry email. Instead, I scanned the fine notice, the appeal form, the denial letter, and the payment confirmation. I created a new folder on my laptop, labeled it with the date, and saved everything inside. Then I opened the HOA's website and downloaded every publicly available document I could find, meeting minutes from the past 2 years, annual financial reports, the complete CC&Rs, the architectural guidelines, and the vendor contract list. Most of it was routine, but on page 17 of the 2023 financial report, I found a line item for towing services contract Mitchell & Sons. The annual value was listed as $42,000 for a community of 200 homes. That seemed like a lot of towed cars. I closed my laptop and went to bed. 47 days until my confirmation hearing. I just needed to stay quiet. The next month brought 2 more violations. The first cited my front lawn grass at 3.2 inches, 0.2 of an inch over the maximum allowable height, $150. I had mowed 5 days earlier, but spring growth apparently waits for no one. The second notice arrived the following week, my garage door color. Pewter mist had been removed from the approved palette in 2022, $300, plus mandatory repainting within 30 days. The previous owner had chosen that color. I had assumed it was compliant. The HOA's records disagreed. $1,200 in accumulated fines, plus the $535 I had already paid for the tow, $1,735 in less than 2 months. I sat at my kitchen table that night, looking at the stack of notices, and made a decision. I would not pay, not yet. I would use every procedural avenue available to me, document every interaction, and force them to follow their own rules to the letter. If I were going to be treated as a problem, I would at least make sure the problem was expensive to administer. I submitted a formal request for a hearing before the full HOA Board of Directors, citing Section 15.2 of the bylaws, which guaranteed homeowners the right to present their case in person before any fine exceeding $500 could be enforced. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the community clubhouse. I spent those 3 weeks preparing. I compiled a timeline of every notice I had received, cross-referenced with the dates of my actual residency. I documented the notification failures, the letter sent to my old address before I even owned the property, and the lack of any grace period for a new homeowner. I researched the garage door paint policy and discovered that pewter mist had been approved continuously from 2015 until 2022, and that no notification had been sent to existing homeowners informing them of the change. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. A folding table at the front, 3 chairs behind it, a single chair facing them like a witness stand. Diane Prescott sat in the center, flanked by Gerald Prescott on her left and Linda Hoffman on her right. A fourth person sat in the corner with a laptop, apparently taking minutes. There were no other residents present. The bylaws allowed homeowners to attend board hearings, but the meeting had been scheduled on the same night as the community's spring social event at the park 3 blocks away. I had seen the flyers, wine and cheese under the stars. I wondered if the timing was coincidental. Diane called the meeting to order and invited me to present my case. I spoke for 12 minutes. I walked through the timeline. I explained the notification failures. I cited the specific bylaws that the HOA had technically followed but practically violated. I was calm, professional, and thorough. When I finished, Diane thanked me for my presentation and asked if the board had any questions. Gerald asked one, "Ms. Rivera, did you read the CC&Rs before purchasing your home?" I told him I had read them at closing, as most homeowners do. He nodded and wrote something on his notepad. Linda asked nothing. She simply watched me with an expression I couldn't quite identify, something between pity and boredom. I asked to see the HOA's mailing records specifically, the proof that notices had been sent and the addresses they had been sent to. Diane shook her head slowly. Internal administrative records are not subject to disclosure under Bylaws Section 7.3, she said. The board has reviewed the records and confirmed that all proper procedures were followed. I asked who had reviewed the records. "The board," she repeated, "which consists of the 3 of us." I looked at Gerald, who managed the funds that collected my fines. I looked at Linda, who chaired the committee that had already denied my appeal. I looked at Diane, whose husband sat 3 feet away from her. Then I sat back in my chair and waited. The vote took less than a minute. Linda moved to deny the appeal. Gerald seconded. Diane called for a vote. 3 in favor, 0 opposed. Diane looked at me with that same patient smile I had seen on my first day in the neighborhood. "Rivera, I want you to know this isn't personal. We have rules because they protect everyone. If someone can't follow basic community standards, perhaps this isn't the right environment for them." She paused, letting the words settle. "You have 14 days to pay the outstanding balance. After that, late fees will accrue at 8% per month, and a lien may be placed on your property." The decision was final. There was no higher authority within the HOA structure, no external body I could appeal to without initiating formal litigation. I had lost. That night, the community message board filled with posts about the hearing. Someone had been talking. "Heard the new lady on Willow Lane tried to fight the board tonight. Didn't go well." The replies came quickly. "These people think they're special. Just follow the rules like the rest of us. I heard she's already been fined 3 times. Red flag. This is why our fees keep going up dealing with problem residents." I read every comment. I recognized none of the usernames. I thought about responding, about explaining my side, about pointing out the conflicts of interest that were sitting in plain sight. Instead, I closed the browser and turned off my phone. The written decision arrived by certified mail 2 days later. Appeal denied. Decision final per Bylaws Section 15.7. Payment due within 14 days. But stapled to the back was something I hadn't seen before, a 1-page summary of the HOA's annual vendor contracts, automatically included in all formal correspondence per some disclosure rule I hadn't noticed. Mitchell & Sons Towing, Prescott & Associates Legal, Greenway Landscaping, 3 vendors, 3 contracts, all approved by the same 3-person board that had just ruled against me. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I photographed it before filing it away. I paid on day 13. The system had won this round, but systems, I knew, eventually produce records. And records have a way of outliving the people who create them. 3 days after I paid the fines, Diane posted a community update on the HOA website. It was titled, "Protecting Our Community Standards, a Message from Your Board." The post didn't mention me by name. It didn't need to. Recently, a newer resident challenged several routine enforcement actions through our formal appeal process. It began. The board conducted a thorough hearing and unanimously upheld the original decisions. We want to assure all homeowners that our rules exist to protect property values and community harmony. We will continue to enforce them fairly and consistently, regardless of any individual's personal objections. The post went on for 3 more paragraphs, praising the community's shared commitment to excellence and thanking residents for their patience during what it called a minor procedural matter. The comments section was filled within hours. "Thank you, Diane, for standing firm. We moved here because of the standards don't let anyone lower them. Some people think rules don't apply to them. Glad the board disagrees. I've seen that woman's lawn. She clearly doesn't care about this neighborhood." I read them all, scrolling through dozens of responses from people I had never met. People who had formed opinions about me based entirely on Diane's carefully worded summary. Not a single comment questioned the board's decision. Not a single person asked for the other side of the story. I was the villain now, and the trial had been conducted without my presence. The social consequences were immediate. The next morning, I walked to my mailbox and passed my neighbor from 2 houses down, a woman I had waved to several times but never formally met. She looked at me, then looked away, adjusting her path so she wouldn't have to walk near me. That afternoon, I saw a group of 3 residents chatting on the corner. When I approached to introduce myself, the conversation stopped. One of them checked her watch. "We should get going," she said, and they dispersed in 3 different directions. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, processing what had just happened. I had been in difficult professional environments before. I had faced opposition, skepticism, and even hostility. But this was something else entirely, the quiet, coordinated rejection of a community that had decided I didn't belong. Over the next 2 weeks, the isolation solidified into something permanent. I received a flyer in my mailbox announcing a block party the following Saturday, a neighborhood tradition, apparently held every spring. I considered attending, if only to show that I wasn't going to hide, but when Saturday came, I watched from my window as neighbors gathered in the cul-de-sac 3 houses down, setting up folding tables and stringing lights between the trees. No one knocked on my door. No one left a personal invitation. I had been edited out of the community, as cleanly as if someone had used a red pen. What struck me most was how efficiently it had happened. 1 post, a few dozen comments, and suddenly, I was a pariah. Diane hadn't needed to campaign against me. She had simply framed the narrative, and the community had done the rest. The message on my car appeared on a Wednesday morning. I had parked in my driveway overnight, following every rule now, obsessively careful, and when I walked outside to leave for work, I saw it. Someone had written in the dust on my rear windshield, using their finger to trace the letters, "Go home, troublemaker." The handwriting was crude, childish almost. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the words. Something shifted in me as I looked at those letters, not anger, not sadness, but a kind of clarity. This was what unchecked authority looked like at the neighborhood level. A board that answered to no one. A community that believed whatever it was told, and somewhere behind all of it, a legal structure that made it all possible. I pulled a cloth from my garage, wiped the glass clean, and drove to work. I didn't report it. There was nothing to report. Dust on a windshield wasn't a crime, but I remembered it. That night, I seriously considered selling the house. The market was strong. I could probably break even, maybe even make a small profit. I could find an apartment closer to the capital, somewhere without a homeowners association, somewhere I could exist without being monitored and measured and found wanting. But then I thought about the confirmation hearing, now just 31 days away. I thought about the opposition researchers who would dig through every public record, every court filing, every hint of controversy. Attorney General nominee flees neighborhood after dispute with HOA. I could already see the headline. It would be spun as evidence of instability, of someone who couldn't handle conflict, of a person unfit for the state's highest legal office. I couldn't give them that ammunition, so I stayed. I stopped trying to engage with the neighborhood. I came home from work, parked in my garage, closed the door behind me, and didn't emerge until morning. I ordered groceries online to avoid running into neighbors at the local store. I became a ghost in my own home, visible only through the lights that turned on and off at predictable hours. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent 20 years building a career on the principle that systems could be made to work fairly, that laws and procedures could protect people from arbitrary power. And now I was hiding in my house, defeated by a 3-person board and a 62-page document I had signed without reading carefully enough. But systems don't sustain themselves. They need infrastructure bylaws, enforcement mechanisms, and legal backing. The neighbors who shunned me believed they were acting on their own judgment, but a structure had shaped their judgment, and every structure has architects. I revisited Diane's community update one evening, looking for something I might have missed. Near the end, I found a paragraph I had skimmed over before. We're proud to have the support of professional legal counsel from Prescott and Associates, who have guided our community through complex matters for 6 years now. Their expertise ensures that all HOA actions are fully compliant with state law. Prescott and Associates. I pulled up the firm's website on my phone. The founding partner was listed as Brian Prescott. The office address was on the same street as the county administrative building. Gerald Prescott, the treasurer, Diane Prescott, the president, Brian Prescott, the attorney, 3 Prescotts, all connected to the same small kingdom. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I added it to my file. 29 days until confirmation. I could survive anything for 29 days. 2 months after the board hearing, the HOA filed a civil lawsuit against me in county court. The complaint arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday afternoon, a thick envelope with the return address of Prescott and Associates. I opened it standing in my kitchen, still wearing my coat from work. The document was 14 pages long, professionally formatted, citing every violation I had accumulated since moving in. The complaint listed the full history, the towing fee of $535, paid, the trash bin fine of $200, paid, the lawn height and garage door fines totaling $450, paid after the board hearing. Then the new violations: a garden hose left visible on the side of my house, $150, a holiday wreath that had remained on my door 3 days past the HOA's approved decoration window, $200, a recycling bin placed at the curb 6 hours before the designated window, $100, late fees at 8% per month on each unpaid amount, administrative processing charges. The total claimed $3,400 in fines, fees, and penalties, plus $2,000 in legal costs, $5,400. And at the bottom of the final page, a request for the court to authorize a lien on my property until the full amount was satisfied. I had stopped paying after the board hearing. The first 3 violations that arrived afterward, the hose, the wreath, the recycling bin, I let them sit. I wanted to force the HOA into formal legal proceedings, where the rules of evidence were different, where I could compel disclosure of documents they had refused to share. But as I stood in my kitchen holding that complaint, I felt the weight of what I had set in motion. This was no longer a dispute about garden hoses and recycling bins. This was a lawsuit, with my name on it, filed in a court of public record. If my confirmation opponents found it, and they would find it, they would use it. The stakes had just gotten higher than I had calculated. I hired a private attorney named David Okonkwo, a solo practitioner who specialized in HOA disputes. I found him through a legal directory, deliberately avoiding anyone connected to my professional network. I couldn't afford even the appearance of using my position for personal advantage. David reviewed my documentation, the timeline, the notification failures, the vendor contract disclosures, and gave me his honest assessment. "You have arguments," he said, "but this is small claims court. The judge is going to look at whether the HOA followed its own bylaws. And technically, it did. The notice was sent, the hearings were held, the votes were recorded. Whether it was fair is a different question than whether it was legal." I asked him what he recommended. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "We fight it anyway. We put everything on the record. and we hope the judge sees what I see, a system designed to be technically correct while being practically unjust. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late spring, 3 weeks before my confirmation vote. I sat at the defendant's table with David beside me, watching as Brian Prescott, the HOA's attorney, Gerald's brother, Diane's brother-in-law, arranged his documents with the casual confidence of someone who had done this many times before. The courtroom was small, fluorescent lit, with worn carpet and a judge's bench that looked like it had been installed in the 1980s. There were perhaps a dozen people in the gallery, mostly waiting for other cases, but I noticed a woman in the back row with a notepad, a reporter from the local newspaper, I would later learn. She was watching me with the particular attention of someone who had been tipped off that something interesting might happen. Brian Prescott presented first. He was smooth, methodical, utterly professional. He walked the judge through each violation, citing the specific bylaw, showing photographs, and producing copies of the notices that had been sent. He emphasized that I had signed the CC&Rs at closing, that I had been given every opportunity to comply, and that the HOA had followed its own procedures at every step. Your Honor, this is not a case of a homeowner being treated unfairly, he concluded. This is a case of a homeowner who chose not to follow the rules that everyone else in the community follows. The HOA is simply asking the court to enforce the agreement that the defendant voluntarily entered into when she purchased her home. David presented our defense. He challenged the notification process the letter sent to my old address, the 14-day compliance window that expired before I even owned the property. He questioned the conflict of interest inherent in a system where the treasurer who collected fines sat on the committee that reviewed appeals. He pointed out that the garage door paint color had been approved for 7 years before being quietly removed from the palette, with no notification to existing homeowners. The judge listened, took notes, and asked a few clarifying questions, but I could see it in his eyes, the same look I had seen in Linda Hoffman's face at the board hearing. He wasn't going to rule against the HOA. The bylaws were clear. The procedures had been followed. The system was working exactly as designed. The judgment came at the end of the hearing. The court finds that the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association acted within its authority under the governing documents. The judge said, "The defendant is ordered to pay the full amount claimed $5,400 within 30 days. A lien will be recorded against the property until payment is received." He looked at me over his glasses. "Ms. Rivera, I understand this feels burdensome, but you agreed to these rules when you bought the house. The court's role is to enforce contracts, not to rewrite them." The gavel came down. Case closed. Final judgment entered. Outside the courthouse, Diane Prescott stood on the steps, speaking to the reporter I had noticed earlier. I heard fragments as I walked past community standards. Equal enforcement, not personal. Then, louder, clearly intended for me to hear, "This is proof that the system works. When someone refuses to follow the rules, there are consequences. That's what protects property values for everyone." I didn't respond. I didn't look at her. I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared at the steering wheel for a long time. It felt like an ending. It had the shape of an ending: the courtroom, the gavel, the judgment. But endings don't usually come with 14 pages of documentation attached. Endings don't create public records. The newspaper article appeared 2 days later. HOA wins lawsuit against Willow Creek homeowner. The story was short, factual, quoting Diane's statement and summarizing the court's ruling. The online comments were predictable. Justice served. Play stupid games. Win stupid prizes. Maybe she'll learn to follow the rules now. But buried in the comments, I noticed something different. A user named HFin Community had written, "Interesting that Mitchell & Sons Towing has had the HOA contract for 6 years now. Does anyone know who owns that company?" The comment had no replies. It sat there, alone, unanswered. I didn't know who HFin was, but someone else was paying attention. I paid the judgment on day 28. The lien was released. My confirmation hearing was in 19 days, and I had a lawsuit on my public record. Every door had closed. Every appeal had been exhausted. I had lost completely. At least, that's what it looked like. The lawsuit created a paper trail that neither Diane nor I had fully anticipated. When a civil case concludes in county court, the entire file becomes part of the public record, not just the judgment, but every exhibit, every contract, every document submitted as evidence. Brian Prescott had been thorough in his presentation. He had included copies of the HOA's vendor agreements to demonstrate the legitimacy of the towing fees. He had attached financial statements to justify the administrative costs. He had submitted 3 years of board meeting minutes to show the consistency of enforcement actions. All of it was now available to anyone who walked into the county clerk's office and asked to see case number 25-CV-0478. The HOA had won the battle. But in winning, they had opened their files to the world. I didn't know any of this at the time. I was focused on my confirmation hearing, which was now 12 days away. I had reviewed every potential question, prepared answers for every line of attack, and briefed my team on how to handle inquiries about the HOA lawsuit if it came up. The local newspaper article had been picked up by one regional outlet, but so far, no one in the political sphere seemed to care about a minor civil dispute in a suburban neighborhood. I allowed myself to believe that the worst was over. I was wrong, of course, but the correction wouldn't come from me. It would come from a 72-year-old man named Harold Finn, who lived 6 houses down from me and had a habit of reading public records for entertainment. Harold had worked for the Internal Revenue Service for 31 years, the last 15 as a forensic accountant specializing in nonprofit fraud. He had retired in 2019, moved to Willow Creek Estates to be closer to his daughter, and promptly discovered that retirement bored him. He filled his days with crossword puzzles, long walks, and an unusual hobby reviewing the financial disclosures of local government entities, city budgets, school district expenditures, and, occasionally, homeowners association records. He had been a member of Willow Creek for 6 years, had attended exactly 2 HOA meetings, and had developed a quiet suspicion about Diane Prescott that he had never acted upon. The newspaper article about my lawsuit gave him a reason to start looking. I learned all of this later, after everything had unraveled. But I can reconstruct what Harold did in those first few days after the verdict, because he documented every step with the meticulous precision of someone who had spent 3 decades building cases against people who thought they were too smart to get caught. He started at the county clerk's office, requesting a complete copy of the court file. He paid the $12 copying fee, took the stack of papers home, and spread them across his dining room table. Then he began to read. The towing contract was the first thing that caught his attention. Mitchell & Sons Towing had held the exclusive agreement with Willow Creek Estates since 2018, the same year Diane Prescott was elected president. The contract specified a fee structure that seemed high to Harold, so he called 3 other towing companies in the area and asked for quotes. Mitchell & Sons was charging 40% more than the market rate. Harold wrote this down. Then he looked up the business registration for Mitchell & Sons Towing with the Secretary of State's office. The registered agent was Kevin Mitchell. The business address was a residential property in a neighboring town. Harold searched property records for that address and found it was owned by Kevin and Sandra Mitchell. He searched marriage records for Sandra Mitchell and found her maiden name, Sandra Prescott, Diane's younger sister. The HOA's towing contractor was run by Diane's brother-in-law. Harold kept digging. The financial statements Brian Prescott had submitted showed that all fines and fees collected by the HOA flowed into something called the Reserve Fund, managed by the treasurer. The treasurer was Gerald Prescott, Diane's husband. Harold had known this, vaguely, but seeing it laid out in official documents gave it a different weight. Every dollar I had paid in fines had passed through Gerald's hands. Every decision to fine me had been made by a board that included Gerald. Harold wrote this down, too. The legal fees were next. Prescott and Associates had billed the HOA $47,000 over the past 3 years for general counsel services and litigation support. Harold looked up the firm's registration, founded by Brian Prescott in 2012. Brian Prescott, Gerald's brother. Harold remembered something else in 2019. Diane had run for county commissioner. She had lost, but the campaign had been well funded. Harold searched the state's campaign finance database and found a $5,000 donation from Brian Prescott to Diane Prescott for county commissioner. The HOA's attorney had financially supported the HOA president's political campaign. Harold wrote this down by the end of the week. Harold had filled a yellow legal pad with notes. Mitchell & Sons brother-in-law, reserve fund husband, legal counsel brother-in-law, campaign donation conflict of interest. He remembered a conversation from 2 years earlier when he had raised a question at an HOA meeting about whether the towing contract should be put out for competitive bid. Diane had dismissed the suggestion immediately. "We have a long-term agreement with Mitchell & Sons," she had said. "They've served this community well. There's no reason to change." Harold had let it go at the time. He was new to the neighborhood, didn't want to make waves, but now he understood why the suggestion had been shut down so quickly. He called the State Ethics Commission the following Monday. The woman who answered transferred him to an investigator, who listened to his summary and asked him to submit a formal written complaint with supporting documentation. "How long does this process take?" Harold asked. 6 to 12 months, typically, the investigator said. "We have a significant backlog." Harold thanked her and hung up. 6 to 12 months. By then, Diane would have been re-elected to another 3-year term. The machine would keep running, but Harold had spent 31 years at the IRS. He knew that institutions move slowly, but they did move. He sat down at his computer that evening, opened a new document, and began to type. Formal ethics complaint regarding Willow Creek Estates HOA Board of Directors. He worked until midnight, attaching exhibits, cross-referencing documents, building a case the way he had built hundreds of cases before, somewhere across the neighborhood. Diane Prescott was probably sleeping soundly, confident that she had won. She had no idea what was coming. 3 weeks passed after Harold submitted his complaint. "I knew nothing about it at the time. Harold and I had exchanged perhaps a dozen words since I moved in, all of them superficial pleasantries about weather and lawn care. But I noticed him one afternoon, walking slowly past my house with his hands clasped behind his back, pausing to look at my garage door as if studying it for something. I raised a hand in greeting from my window. He nodded and disappeared around the corner. I thought nothing of it. My confirmation hearing was in 6 days, and the final preparation sessions had consumed every waking hour. The HOA lawsuit had surfaced in one background briefing. A junior staffer had flagged it as a potential vulnerability, but my team had assessed the risk as minimal. A minor civil dispute over homeowner fees. Not the kind of thing that derailed careers. Harold, meanwhile, was learning what happens when an ordinary citizen tries to hold a small institution accountable. He had called the State Ethics Commission twice since submitting his complaint, both times. He was told that his case was in the queue, that investigators were reviewing the documentation. The second call, a supervisor had gently suggested that complaints involving private homeowners associations were lower priority than those involving elected officials or public agencies. "We take all complaints seriously," she had said, "but resources are limited. I can't give you a timeline." Harold understood bureaucratic language. Lower priority meant his complaint would sit in a folder until someone had nothing else to do. It meant that Diane Prescott would be re-elected to another 3-year term before anyone opened his file. What Harold didn't know was that Diane had connections inside the county administrative building. Her failed campaign for county commissioner had left her with relationships, favors owed, and information channels that operated below official procedure. Someone in the clerk's office had mentioned that a Willow Creek resident had requested the full court file from the HOA lawsuit. Someone else had mentioned that the same resident had been asking questions about towing contracts. The information traveled through the network until it reached Diane. She didn't know exactly what Harold had found, but she knew he was looking, and she knew how to make him stop. The emergency board meeting was announced with 48 hours notice, the minimum required under the bylaws. The agenda listed a single item, Amendment to Community Standards Policy Section 23, Frivolous Complaints. I received the notice by email but didn't attend. I was in the Capitol. Rehearsing testimony, Harold attended. He told me later that there were only 7 residents in the room. Diane presented the proposed amendment herself. "We've become aware of a disturbing pattern," she said. "Certain individuals have been filing baseless complaints with external agencies, wasting community resources and damaging our reputation. This amendment will impose a $500 penalty on any resident who files a formal complaint against the HOA or its board members that is later determined to be without merit." She paused. "This protects all of us from bad actors who want to tear down what we've built together." The vote was 3-1 in favor. Gerald and Linda supported Diane without comment. Thomas Brewer voted against. "This feels like it's targeting someone specific," he said. Diane smiled patiently. "It's targeting anyone who abuses the system. The rules apply equally to everyone." The amendment passed. Harold walked home in the dark, understanding exactly what had happened. The trap was elegant, airtight, and completely legal. The fine arrived 3 days later, before the Ethics Commission had even responded to Harold's complaint. The notice cited Section 23A Preliminary Assessment of Complaint Merit and stated that the board had determined Harold's external filing to be frivolous on its face. $500, due within 14 days. Harold called me that evening, the first real conversation we had ever had. He explained everything: the public records, the towing tract, the family connections, the retaliatory amendment. I listened in silence, sitting in my hotel room, the television muted on legislative coverage. When he finished, I told him the only truth I could offer. I can't get involved. If I intervene in a private dispute that could eventually come before my office, I compromise everything: the case, my position, the integrity of whatever outcome might follow. I'm bound by the same ethics rules I'll be sworn to enforce. There was a long pause. "I understand," Harold said finally. "I just thought you should know. You're not the only one she's done this to." The confirmation hearing happened the following Monday. It went smoothly. No questions about the HOA lawsuit, no ambushes, no surprises. The committee voted to recommend my confirmation by a margin of 7-2. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the weight of Harold's words. "You're not the only one she's done this to." I thought about the Hispanic couple he had mentioned, the ones who sold their house in 2022 after months of escalating fines. I thought about how many others there might be, scattered across the years, people who had simply given up rather than fight a system designed to crush them. Harold put his house on the market the day after we spoke. I saw the sign when I returned from the Capitol, a red and white for sale placard planted in his front lawn like a flag of surrender. He was 72 years old. He had moved here to be close to his daughter, and now he was leaving because a woman with a clipboard had decided he was a threat. I stood at my window, watching the sign sway in the breeze. A car pulled into his driveway, his daughter, come to help him pack. The community message board was already buzzing. Good riddance to troublemakers. Finally, some peace. The narrative was written. Harold was the villain, Diane was the protector, and I was invisible. That night, I cataloged the avenues in my mind. The HOA's internal appeals exhausted. The civil court judgment entered, case closed. The State Ethics Commission buried in a queue that wouldn't move for months. My own authority as incoming Attorney General ethically prohibited from use. Every legitimate channel had been tried. Every door had been closed, not slammed, but quietly shut by people following procedures they had written themselves. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, and I had no lawful way left to change that. My phone buzzed. "Congratulations. Your Senate confirmation vote has been scheduled for Monday at 11 a.m. 3 days? Everything would change in 3 days. I just didn't know how much. The Senate confirmed me on a Monday morning, 73 days after my car was towed from Willow Creek Estates. The vote was 31-18, along party lines. I stood in the Capitol Rotunda with my hand on a Bible, reciting the oath of office while cameras flashed and my staff applauded politely. The governor shook my hand. Reporters shouted questions. I smiled, gave a brief statement about serving the people of the state, and retreated to my new office on the 4th floor. By noon, my name was in every newspaper in the state. By evening, it had reached Willow Creek. I didn't make any calls. I didn't send any emails. I didn't use my new position to open investigations or issue subpoenas. I did nothing because doing anything would have been the one thing I couldn't do. But I didn't need to act. The system, once exposed to sunlight, began to move on its own. The first reporter called the HOA office 2 days after my swearing in. She had covered my confirmation hearing, remembered the minor civil lawsuit in my background file, and decided to dig deeper. She found the court records. She found Harold's Ethics Commission complaint, which had become public when he filed it. She found the towing contract with Mitchell & Sons, the reserve fund managed by Gerald Prescott, the legal fees paid to Brian Prescott, and the campaign donation from 2019. She called Diane for comment. Diane declined. The story ran on Thursday. New Attorney General's HOA dispute reveals web of family contracts. By Friday, 3 more outlets had picked it up. By Saturday, the State Ethics Commission had moved Harold's complaint to the top of the queue. The investigation took 4 weeks. I was not involved. I recused myself formally, in writing. The day after the first article appeared, a career investigator named Sandra Morrison handled the case. She interviewed Harold, reviewed the documents, subpoenaed bank records, and traced the money. Mitchell & Sons Towing, owned by Kevin Mitchell, Diane's brother-in-law, contract awarded without competitive bidding. Reserve fund managed by Gerald Prescott, with no independent oversight. Legal counsel Brian Prescott, who had donated $5,000 to Diane's political campaign while billing the HOA $47,000 over 3 years. The conflicts of interest weren't hidden. They had simply never been examined. The Ethics Commission issued its findings on a Tuesday afternoon. The Board of Directors of Willow Creek Estates HOA violated State Ethics Code Section 12.4, governing conflicts of interest in fiduciary organizations. All financial decisions made by the current board during the period of 2018 through 2025 are hereby subject to review and potential rescission. The board is ordered to dissolve. Diane Prescott is prohibited from holding any position of fiduciary responsibility in the state for a period of 10 years. Gerald was referred to the State Attorney General's office, my office, though I would never touch the case for potential misappropriation of funds. Brian Prescott received a formal complaint to the State Bar Association. Mitchell & Sons lost their contracts with every HOA in the county within a month. The fines were refunded, all of them. $5,400 returned to my account, plus interest. Harold received his $500 back, plus a formal apology from the interim board. He took his house off the market. I saw him 2 weeks later, watering his lawn on a Saturday morning. I was walking to my mailbox. We made eye contact across the street. He nodded. I nodded back. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing left to say. Diane's house went up for sale in August. I never saw her again. The system had worked. It just needed someone to turn on the lights.